Welcome to this episode of the Future Insight podcast. I'm thrilled to have you with us as we explore the ideas, innovations, and emerging trends that are shaping tomorrow's world. Whether you're tuning in from home, on the go, or during a break in your day, we're glad you chose to spend this time with us. Today, we're excited to welcome our guest to the show, an expert and thought leader whose perspectives will help us dig deeper into the innovations and breakthroughs driving the future. Our guest today is Dr. Tinukwa Boulder. She is the Director of Innovative Technology and Online Learning and Professor of Practice at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you for joining us. We can't wait to hear about your experience and research, but before we begin, Dr. Boulder, I always ask our guests to provide us with a little bit of insight into your professional journey that brought you to this position you currently hold at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Dr. Cantu, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this interview. I look forward to our conversation. I had an interesting journey in higher education, actually. I graduated in 2010 with a degree in instructional systems and workforce development, and it's not called instructional systems anymore. The field has changed. And then that was kind of when the recession hit, and there wasn't really a lot of faculty positions. So I thought, well, what's my plan B? And then I thought, instructional design was kind of a gradually emerging field. And so I got a job as an instruction designer in the Ghana University in Erie. And so I worked there for 7 years. And honestly, it was a godsend in many ways because I would have been a terrible educator had I not started off as an instructional designer. It really taught me to think intentionally about design, like how do I design instruction? How do I think about students and learners and what they need? And how do I use technology in ways that are meaningful, not just for technology's sake? So it really helped me hone my teaching skills and design skills. And then I switched and worked at Penn State Behrend for a while as an instructional designer, more of a lateral move. And then I ended up at the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh in this kind of dual role. And throughout my career, I've always had this kind of administrative and then faculty role, kind of dual roles. So it kind of aligned well with my goals. And so now I have a faculty position in the Department of Teaching, Learning and Leading, and then I have at the Dean's Office level, I'm a Director of Innovative Technologies and Online Learning. And there I get to combine my love of instruction design and course development and online learning, and then I get to teach and do the faculty position. So that's kind of how I ended up in this role. I hope I answered your question.
Excellent, absolutely. One of my first questions is going to look at your role as an instructional designer, but in particular with the integration of technology in the teaching and learning process. I know you've done a lot of research in that area. Yeah. I know one of the things that you focus on is strategies for using mobile devices in the classroom, for example. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, the integration, particularly of mobile devices in particular, but just sort of writ large as well, just on how technology impacts the educational landscape for students today?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, no, as an instruction designer, I think, one of the challenges, I suppose, that faculty come to us with is, there's a vast amount of technology out there. I'd like to be able to use this tool. At the time, many years ago, it was clickers, right? It was like, let's use the clickers in the classroom. And so I think part of and these are things that people perhaps may not mention when they talk about technology integration is, first, how do we help and support the faculty to feel comfortable with the technology? So there's a kind of like softer skills, like we always focus on how do I use the tool, but how do we help faculty feel comfortable with the technology? But also, a question I always ask, which I don't think is always popular, is there a need for the tech in the classroom, right? So sometimes technology isn't the solution. Sometimes it's a change in strategy, right? But where there is a need to kind of, we have a faculty who wants to play with a particular tool and they think it will support student learning, we provide the supports and learn the technology together with the faculty and the student. But it is tricky. I mean, even as an instruction designer, somebody who's comfortable with technology, to keep up. And so we do have to be strategic about the technology that we select and use. And again, it has to go hand in hand. It's like the pedagogy of technology integration, right? How does it align with our teaching and instructional goals? How does it meet students' needs? And then what is our capacity for troubleshooting technology. I think that's the piece, right? Because as I advise faculty all the time, is that you are kind of at the front line then for troubleshooting, right? IT may not necessarily know all the tools that you're using. Sometimes we're using tech that's not really approved by the university. And so you then have to be the tech person that problem solves. And so you have to think about that component as well when you introduce technology in your classroom, that you're comfortable with navigating some challenges that may arise. But I think the challenges that we face when we think about technology is always technology resistance, right? There's that other end, and technophobia always. And so we work with faculty, right, to kind of say, okay, what is the technology that makes sense for you? You don't have to it doesn't have to be high tech. We can do some cool things with pen and paper. That's still a technology, right? It doesn't have to be a high tech tool. But we can think through a design that kind of works for you, regardless of the technology that you're using, whether it's low tech, mid tech, high tech. I'm not sure I answered all your questions, but you talked about mobile devices.
Right.
So this is always going to be a sticking point. I don't know, Dr. Cantu, if you've had this in your experience as well. I feel like we're having the same conversations about mobile devices that we're having with AI at the moment, right? And generative AI, where it's like, ban it, don't use it at all. It needs to be put in this bucket before you come into my classroom. And I'm of the lens of how do we use it to teach. And I think there are ways in which, it's a tool that students have and use. And yes, it's also a distraction, of course, but, there are apps that you could use that, if a student happens to have, if you're lucky enough to have all students having smartphones, there are ways in which you can integrate it in the classroom. Like I even use Kahoots as a really quick quizzing app with my grad students, and they love it because of that friendly competition. So I think if there are ways that you could use it responsibly, right? And other ways I've thought about this in terms of not necessary use of mobile devices is also policies, right? How do you involve students in policies around mobile device use and responsible use in the classroom, or no use, right? And if they're involved in development of policy, then they can hold themselves and their peers accountable, even without you having to do so. So there are different strategies there in terms of, if you are really going to say, no, I don't want it, then how do we have a more communal or relational approach to policy development that invites students to have a conversation around whatever you think is appropriate use of devices in the classroom. Yeah.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And talk a little bit about, I know you some of your research focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the landscape. And we all experience that, and we recognize the role that event had on our integration of technology, whether it's in K-12 or in higher education. Talk a little bit about that and what you see as the takeaway from our experiences there relative to the timeline of technology integration into the teaching and learning environment.
Yeah, no, that was an interesting experience for me, because I think I got the job at the University of Pittsburgh like a month before that happened. And then it was like, okay, well done. I'm glad we hired you for this position. Now help everyone get online quickly.
Right.
Yes. And my particular context was interesting because we were also migrating from Blackboard learning management system to Canvas. So there was lots of new things obviously going at once. So now that obviously you can look back on hindsight, right? What I describe it as that everyone says they have to move to online learning, but really it's remote learning, and it was emergency remote learning. And so I had to kind of quickly think about how do we scale up course design very quickly. And what things do we kind of give up? We didn't have the luxury of all the quality assurances that we had to do from an instructional design standpoint, but it was really difficult. So I had to let go of some of my kind of like, we must do it this way. I had to let that go. But then how do we work with faculty who have been teaching a particular content in person for a long time, right? How do we navigate that? And I think one of the challenges with COVID is that all of us had to learn new things on the fly, right? We all had to learn Zoom. Zoom became a thing. It became a noun, verb, adjective. It became a thing. And so we had to learn kind of how to integrate, to navigate this new kind of teaching format, a learning format on the fly, which I think faculty are used to doing, but not all at once, not in this really kind of stressful context. So I think part of the challenge I saw was one, preparing faculty quickly to be able to navigate whether they were doing things asynchronously or doing a combination of asynchronous and synchronous online, and having to think about how are we in community with students, even in this online space. How are we mindful of people who don't want to have their cameras on? Like, we have to kind of think through policies that we never had to think through before, and develop kind of modes and protocols for communication in this synchronous and learning environment that we never had to do before. So I found a lot of collaboration across the school, but also across institutions, sharing ideas. That was great. The idea of that we were all in it together, we're trying to learn.
Mhm.
Yeah, there were mistakes made, obviously. Some people still remain disengaged, but we found really cool ways to stay in community. We had like a kind of online coffee meetups with just anybody will show up. And we all just tried to stay in community with each other. So we made kind of more effort than we probably would have done in the past to really stay connected, because people were feeling isolated away from their family and friends. So there's this academic side, but then there's this kind of social community side as well that we decided to think through once we caught our breath and thought, okay, people are struggling. How do we stay connected?
Right, right. In examining the current landscape, one of the variables that has an impact on the teaching and learning environment, both from the perspective of the students themselves, but also the instructors or the teachers, is that this is a new population of students, Gen Z students, and it's not a matter of whether or not they learn differently. It's just how do they learn differently
Yes.
today, this new generation. So talk a little bit about that and what you
Yeah.
find to be the more efficacious approaches, instructional approaches or strategies within the classroom in teaching Gen Z students.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I've been learning a lot about this. I teach primarily grad students, so I haven't taught undergrad for a long time. But in conversations with faculty, there is, I mean, students who've kind of obviously grown up experiencing COVID and happen to be COVID learners as they are self-described. I think there's certainly a need for more reassurance, right? There's a lot of need for kind of, I don't want to call it hand holding, but perhaps more guidance in terms of how learning is structured. Faculty will often say like they really need more examples of things before they can do a thing, right? And so the idea is like, how do we support students to kind of show initiative and just take a step and a leap at trying something, even if it might mean that they will fail or they might not do it as well. And then providing that guidance to say like, learning, that's how we learn, is through just trial and error. Right. And I think there's a reluctance to do that. I'm seeing across the board from the students, and maybe there's a lack of confidence then. How do we build up and support students to be able to just explore and be comfortable in knowing they may not know the answer? That it's okay that you might not always have an example of a thing. Like when you're out in the workplace, you might just need to just try and see if it will work, right? We don't always have these templates, provided to us. So there is that, and there's some strategies for that, right? There's small kind of teaching components, and there's small learning assignments that are low risk, that can help students kind of try, play, and then it gets progressively more challenging, that faculty can use and integrate into their classrooms, for sure. I mean, the other component of this that we also need to talk about is the anxiety, right? There's a large report of kind of mental health challenges that our students are kind of experiencing now, that are more reported than ever. And finding ways to navigate that and account for that in our classroom in ways that are supportive and not punitive. And I think that's something that faculty are having to find that they're dealing with more so than they are, and not being prepared to do so. But in terms of teaching, I think I don't know. I don't want to say that the Gen Z students are vastly different from all the students that we've had before. Apart from obviously having to deal with the isolation issues of COVID, I think the challenges that students experience is still the same. Like, we need to design instruction intentionally, right? We have to think about the students that are in the classroom, design for those students in the classroom, and we adjust and we accommodate our teaching and our design to meet their needs, right? And so those strategies don't change. They're still the same regardless of who is in our classroom, as long as we're making those changes and being flexible and adaptable, and maybe using technology where applicable.
Right, right. You talk about mental health as a focus within the teaching and learning environment. And I know one of the recently you delivered a paper at Chicago International Summit on Education, looking at using the pedagogy of technology integration and social emotional learning. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how we as instructors, how we can benefit, and more importantly, how our students benefit when we focus on that?
No, I always will go back to design because that's kind of my strength, and I think, when we think about the social and emotional learning, and I teach primarily online, so that's always going to be kind of my go-to example. A place where it is really easy for students to kind of feel isolated, and where building community is really difficult. So, social and emotional learning, it's a key component of that, right? How do I create an environment where students don't really see each other and can only communicate in, one person posts, and it could be 24 hours for somebody else posts, for them to kind of connect. And so it's one, you can use a learning management system to create that kind of space for students to share experiences, like connecting the pedagogical content to students' learning experiences. How have you done a thing in your space? What was the experience? What did you get from it? How did you apply theory? Right. So we use this kind of discussion forums to do that. But I like to use tools that kind of support multimodal learning. So, if I use things like Padlet, I've asked students to even share, they would share an image, or they would share a video, or they would share music. And I think last term, a couple of people shared music to reflect their thoughts or their understanding of a particular concept. And so this kind of led to other conversations about where music has been important. When we're talking about instruction design broadly, this is a course that kind of lends itself to different types of ways of, teaching content. And so using tools like Padlet that's multimodal allows for students not just to use text as a way of communicating, but they use different types of medium to communicate their understanding. I use a lot of peer review, and so students then get to provide audio feedback where possible, and I do that too. I think what I try to do is, as well as using technology to support this, but it's also to kind of give time in the online space to do that, right? To really attend to the students in terms of getting to know them. Who are they as professionals? And recognizing that they have experience and expertise in the classroom that are also strengths, right? And leaning on Bell Hook's pedagogy of how to recognize students' experiences as assets in the classroom. I try and cultivate that and build that. I don't know that I'm always successful. And then that tends to kind of set the stage for trust, at least some sort of relationship that's been built in the classroom. Great. I'm not quite sure I answered your question. I apologize.
No, you did. You did. Yeah, absolutely. In the late 1960s, there was a movie called The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman, and there was an individual that was dispensing sage advice as to what they saw on the landscape, on the horizon, in terms of an area to go into. And the term he said, or he dispensed, was plastics. If that same movie was filmed today, undoubtedly, what the individual would be telling this new graduate would be artificial intelligence, AI. And we talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit, unpack AI today. I know we talked about we don't live in a world of it, if whether we integrate it or use it or not, it's going to be used. It's already been integrated throughout many different sectors, in business, in education, and in healthcare and so on. So it's here, and it's bringing about greater efficacy. That's undeniable. But talk a little bit about, particularly, as an instructional designer and as an educator, on where you see us today relative to the integration of AI in the teaching and learning environment, and where you see us just 5 years down the road.
Wow, that's a tricky question to answer. Thank you. You're right. I mean, I agree with you that it is already here, and people, students, academia, education, whatever sector are using it. But there are some people who are not. I would say that I do know of. It's a complex question because there certainly are some benefits, of course, using generative AI. There's no doubt, right? And we can kind of outsource certain work that we don't want to do to AI, to generative AI. Certainly, I think thinking about it now within this context where it's just this blossomed thing where what's happening is that education institutions are trying to keep up, right? We're trying to keep up with this technology, and we don't have policies or understanding of how we want students to use it. And I think that's always a challenge with tech. Is tech is always a fast pace ahead, and often educators aren't consulted in its development. But I think what we need to consider just now within this context is what does responsible use of AI look like, of generative AI look like for us, right? Because you and I, in the business of education, of educating folks, right? And we want students to be critical thinkers, right? We want students to be able to grapple and struggle, right, with a thing, whatever that concept is, and then come out and think about ways in which they may apply it to their own professional context and use it, right? What I see that could be a potential for us to be concerned about is people, students, and faculty alike, whoever, outsourcing thinking, outsourcing learning, right, with generative AI, because it's fast, it's efficient, it's not always accurate. There's that component to it. So I think educators we need to be having those conversations, right? This is a tool, and how do we use it to support teaching and learning in ways that is responsible, ethical, right, and intentional. 5 years from now, I think looking at the projections of what people are saying, 5 years from now, there could be certain jobs that are obsolete, right? And so maybe that will mean that certain programs are obsolete, right? We might not need to teach people particular skills, wherever those skills are. And so we will need to think about how we retain kind of our humanity in some ways, and how do we maintain things that are uniquely human as we're having this technological tool kind of take on some of these tasks that we're used to doing and we used to do, right? How do we live alongside this tool so we don't have the Terminator moment, to quote another movie, where the technology takes over? I hope that we can use this where we're still human-driven, centered world in which a tech is a tool. My worry is that there's a flip side of this where technology is kind of everything and the humans are set to the side, and I don't want to see that. And we also need to understand as well that the technology, artificial intelligence, as one of my colleagues says, is a mirror, right? So it isn't perfect. It's got embedded inequities, right? There's environmental factors for us to consider. So I would hope that we would think about ways in which we can use this tool in ways that kind of truly support the advancement of humans in ways that do not harm us, right, or derail us in any way. Not that I want to be fear-mongering for your audience, but I really want us to kind of think critically about the use of generative AI, and in ways in which we could really leverage it for our benefit.
Excellent. Do you see, I know you talk about you teach in an online environment. Do you see the pendulum swinging more in this near horizon to online, or at least hybrid, if not online, particularly in higher education?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think there's an increase. I definitely see the pendulum going towards online as institutions think, well, it's probably cheaper, much more economical to have online instruction in some ways. But it is a worry because, I think as we think about student enrollment, right, that's always going to be a thing. And people think, well, online will be a great way to be able to boost enrollment. We can have broader reach, but it has to be done well, and it has to make sense for the program, right, and for the topics. I don't think that every single, although I am in online, I will say this, that every single program lends itself obviously to online instruction, maybe hybrid, but I think there's still a need for that interpersonal connection, right? Even though you can create some of that, right, in an online space, there are some courses that lend itself well to in-person instruction. But to answer your question in a nutshell, yes, the online is just growing. But also, I would say one last thing, that the ways in which we define online learning is really broad as well. It isn't just asynchronous, right? So that's what's exciting about online learning, is like we can have different types of configuration of online synchronous, like we're doing, or online asynchronous, or a combination of both. And so that kind of makes it exciting to see where it goes.
Right. And I'm sure you have had a similar experience. We also see different levels of integration when you juxtapose undergraduate education with graduate
Yes.
education, particularly the latter. It's much more common to see that, because a lot of times folks that are pursuing graduate degrees are out there in the professions, and so
Yeah.
that's one of the things that their schedules demands is that sort of latitude or flexibility.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think we certainly need to account for that. And I think one of the things that we probably need to do, and maybe other institutions do this better than we do, is certainly prepare. How do we prepare students to be really, successful online learners, right? And providing those supports ahead of time, like, am I a good online learner? What does it take for me to be an online? And particularly for undergraduate students, as you said, Gen Z may have particular challenges, right? And not maybe even having poor experiences of online learning because of COVID. Like, so how do we prepare them for a better learning experience, hopefully, and how do we prepare faculty too? Like, I think that's the thing, is why we have these mixed results, is that really there's supports out there, and I think if we want to grow online learning in its multiple configurations, we need to provide that support before they enter or even teach or learn in an online space.
Right, have that requisite technology infrastructure, but also that professional development, I think, is essential.
Yeah, and I wonder if AI is something that could help with that.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. Good point. Well, as we wrap up this episode, a huge thank you goes out to our guest for sharing her expertise. I also want to thank our listeners for your continued support as we explore together the international educational landscape and horizon. Until next time, this is Dean Cantu for the Future Insight podcast, where tomorrow begins today. Take care and stay well.